Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, DevNursery.com, GrokOverflow.com. I have lots of websites. But the point of this video is just to kind of create an introductory video for people who are looking to become a software developer. The purpose of this video is to kind of get you familiar with the tools and kind of how to start learning about the tools that you're going to be needing as a web developer. This is a great video to watch if you're about to start like a boot camp or just starting to learn or going down the path of learning to become a developer in any way. Start here. Okay. So first off, I just want to introduce a resource where you can learn more about many of the things I'm going to talk about. This is docs.devnursery.com. Okay, so remember that URL, docs.devnursery.com. Here you can find kind of all the information you'd want to know. Okay, so if you go here on the main page, you click here, New Dev Docs, it's going to take you to this page. And honestly, what I would do is I would just read these starting from the beginning. Okay, they are in a logical order for you following your journey. So the idea is like if you kind of go through this in the order that is there, you're going to kind of have a nice reference on all the things you should know or aim to learn about as a developer. Okay, starting with just sort of like how your computer works, your operating system. Okay, so I am personally operating from a Linux operating system. Okay, and I like operating from a Linux operating system just because I've gotten used to it, but also like the vast majority of web servers out there are operating Linux. So just basically operating natively from Linux really kind of gives me a feel for working with many different web technologies, particularly when I'm working on the back end. And those words probably don't mean anything yet, but they will as you learn more. Okay. But bottom line is I would read through this because basically there are going to be differences in how you are going to handle development on your environment. When I say your environment, meaning like the computer you're using, the particular operating system you're using, the particular web browser you're using, the particular editing software, all of these pieces together make up your environment in which you are doing your work. Okay? So essentially, each individual computer where you write software for is going to be a different environment for that software. Okay, so if you think about it that way, that should kind of get you the whole idea of environment pretty clear pretty quickly. Okay, so again, bottom line, many of the things I'm going to talk about, you can find out more about here, such as like HTML, CSS. These are your fundamental things. Again, I will let you read these on your own time. Just make sure that you're aware they're here. Not only do you have all these references that you can read, and the cool thing is when you click on any section, there's a breakdown of that section over here. So if you need to get to a particular place pretty quickly, you can just click over here and that'll take you to the section of that page pretty quickly. But there's also cheat sheets. So if you're just looking up for like quick commands, you can find like git commands here, shell commands, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and more is constantly being added. Okay. Also, there's a section on videos. Okay, so here we have like useful tutorials, resources. If I go back down to this other section, useful videos. Here's basically I have hundreds of videos on all of this stuff all over the web. If you want to find a particular playlist for a particular technology, they're all listed here so that way you can find the videos you need for whatever you are learning. Okay, so basically you have the written stuff here and you got the videos here. You got plenty of material to work with. So just kind of want to introduce that there. But the main tools that you need to be familiarizing yourself, one is the web browser. So I'm using Chrome. That's my web browser. Because nowadays, most software development is web development. Okay, if you think about most of the software you use nowadays, it's in the browser. They are web applications. So when you think about Google Docs, Figma, Canva, all these things that people use on a regular basis, they're all built in the browser. You use them from inside the browser. You no longer, or at least not as often, have native desktop software. And the nice thing about that is that when you write web applications that run in the browser, you can use them on any computer. You can use them on Mac, Windows, and Linux because they all have internet browsers. It's a standard sort of thing. Okay? But as a developer, you need to understand how your computer works because you are interacting with your computer to build software. Okay, and again, at the end of the day, software are just instructions telling your computer to do certain things that it is able to do. Okay, so generally when you're talking about your computer, in this case, I'm using Linux. I'm using specifically a Linux distro known as Pop OS. Okay, which I enjoy quite a bit, but it's not the only version of Linux. There's actually lots of versions of Linux. And then there's Windows and Mac, which are completely different operating systems. Okay? Generally, there's two ways to talk to your computer. There's what most people use, which is referred to as, right here, when I can click on little icons that represent the different programs. This is referred to as a graphical user interface. Okay? And this is all fun and good. Graphical user interfaces are typically easier to use, but they are limited. Okay? Basically, only what other developers let you do graphically can you do, right? If someone didn't create something for me to click on or something to interact with for me to tell the computer a specific thing, then I can't do it. So I'm limited by the graphical interface. Okay? What if I want to be in an environment where I can tell the computer to do anything that I want without limitation? Well, then I have to use what's called a command line interface. Okay? And that's also generally referred to as terminal. Okay? It could be referred to as command line interface, CLI. It could be referred to as a terminal. It could be referred to as a shell environment. These are all referring to the same thing. The idea here is I talk to my computer via commands. Okay? And then there's basically a language that is used here to be able to talk to my computer to do different things. Okay? And essentially, it's the same things that you're used to doing with the graphical. Like, for example, I have a graphical way of interacting with my computer's file system. So if I click here on files, this would be like my computer on Windows, or clicking on the Finder in Mac. If I click this, I get this like nice folder view, right? So now what happens here? Like, I'm gonna just create a folder in here real quick. So I can just right click, in an area. Let me make this bigger. Make sure nothing's highlighted. Usually it's a little bit easier for me to create a folder, but let me go into like an empty folder. Let's see here. Let's go into this MISC folder. In here, I'll create a new folder called exercise. And since today's October 27th, we'll just call it 10/27/23. And see, I can create a folder, and then I can go inside that folder, and I can create another folder, which we'll call cheese. So you see, I can interact with the way data is structured in my operating system. So the way that my operating system has stored files in the hard drive of the computer. So that's the file system. So there's files that are organized into folders. I can interact with that graphically, but I can also interact with that through the command line. All the command line is another way for me to talk to the same computer that I'm talking to when I'm clicking around on things. So anything I can do visually, I can do through a command. Okay? And generally the way this terminal is always working is that I'm in a particular folder. So I can type in PWD, which stands for print working directory, which means the current folder that the terminal is in. So you have to imagine kind of like a video game where you can go from like room to room. Okay, each folder is like a room you can travel to. And the folders in that folder are folders you can travel to from that room. Okay, so if I do PWD, generally you're always going to start in your home folder. So for like Linux, it's like /home/ your username. For like Windows, it's like C Windows user /username. And if you're talking about like Mac, I think it's like /user /username. You'll know when you do this PWD command, generally the terminal, if you're opening up a standalone terminal editor, is generally going to start in that place. And now I can type in commands to just move where I am. Okay, so I created that. We had that folder MISC that we saw a second ago. So if I go to my home folder here, so I click home, I'll see I had that MISC folder, which was right down here. See miscellaneous. Okay, and see I can click on it there, but in my shell, I can just type in CD for change directory and say, hey, I want a CD into the MISC folder. And how do I know that that folder is there? I could type in ls, and that's going to list everything in that folder. So I see here, there is that MISC folder. So now I can go say, hey, I want a CD into that folder, MISC. And now I can see that what's called my prompt is always this text that precedes where I insert text. My prompt is telling me that that's where I'm at. Okay, yours may or may not tell you that. Every prompt is different depending on how you're accessing your terminal. Okay, mine has a happy face because I customized it. But if I type in that command again, PWD, you'll notice, see, now I'm inside the MISC folder. And again, that MISC folder is where I created that exercise folder from earlier. So I can do CD exercise 10/27/23. and I can change that folder. And you probably think, it's like, Alex, you typed that really fast. How did you do that? Okay, if I go back up, which I can always go back up a folder, so I can go to the parent folder by doing cd dot dot. Dot dot always represents the parent folder. Okay, if I do that, if I do cd and I type in the first couple letters of the folder name, since there's nothing else that starts with EXER, I can hit tab and it will autocomplete. So I can type that much quicker. Okay, and you can see that I'm able to explore, and I can also make a folder. So I can make a folder called bread. Okay, and I'll notice that if I click on exercise 10, 27, 23, now there's a folder called bread and a folder called cheese. So at the end of the day, like what I'm interacting with is the same computer. So the same computer you're interacting with your graphical interface is the same computer that I'm interacting with here. I'm just doing it directly. Okay, the visual interface is just an abstraction, which just means it's a veil to make something that might seem more complex seem easier. Okay, that's all it is. Okay. Now, I'm not going to get through all the commands here in terminal. For that, I would recommend that you go read docs.devnursery.com to learn more about the different commands in terminal, or check out the videos I've done on this in the past. But the idea is that you want to learn how to work with this. Now, oftentimes there are many programs that you don't even realize are on your computer because the way you interact with those programs are through the command line interface. Okay. One of those is a program by the name of Git. Okay. You'll know generally if you want to know if you have a particular program in your shell, typically what you can do is you can type in the name of the command for that program. Like if you know what it is, you kind of have to know for the different programs you want to use. So in this case, called Git, I can type in git dash dash version, and you can usually do dash dash version after pretty much any program because it's kind of standard. And what it'll do is that if the program exists on your computer, it should return you back the version of that program you are running. For example, I don't have a program called mac and cheese. So if I type in mac and cheese dash dash version, I'm going to get an error. So you'll see it says command not found because that doesn't exist on my computer. Okay? Because whatever the first thing I type in, so anything before the first space, the shell thinks it's a command. Okay, just to understand like how the shell works. This is the same on all computers. Okay, it's gonna so when it sees mac and cheese first, it thinks that's a command. And what it's gonna do is that it has a thing called the path. A path is a list of a bunch of folders where the computer's gonna go look for those programs. And if the program isn't in any of those folders, then it means command not found. How do I know what folders it's looking in? Well, generally it's in a variable called path. Okay. Now, some of these commands will be different if you're on Windows, because the default terminal environment on Windows is different than on Linux and Mac. On Linux and Mac, you're using bash, which is what I'm using right now. Okay. On Windows, you're generally using CMD or PowerShell. Okay, whose commands are different. They can do all the same things, but the commands are different. To see what the different commands are, again, refer to docs.devnursery.com. There's a cheat sheet that shows you the commands for both. But just keep in mind that if you're on Windows and you're in PowerShell, these commands will be slightly different. And you might not necessarily have Git out of the box. You'll have to go online and look for something called Git Bash that creates a version of Bash for Windows that will have Git available for it. So just Google Git Bash and install it. Okay, but in Bash, the command echo allows me to print a value. And so if I want to print a variable, I can just print the variable, and the variable always starts with a $sign. So it's the path variable. So I'm saying, hey, print me the value of the path variable. And see, there's a big list of folders. And again, you can see the difference is that anytime you see these like colon, that's where like we split the different folders. So this is like the first folder that you look at. That goes in there, and then there's a colon. So then this is another folder that I could look for. And essentially, whenever I type in a command, it's actually going to go through each of those folders to see. So when I typed in mac and cheese, it looked inside of all these folders, okay, to see if the command is there. Okay, the reason I'm pointing this out is because one of the typical problems people have is they'll install something, and for some reason it doesn't work in their shell. They're like, I type in the command and I keep saying command not found, typically because it is either you didn't actually install it, or two, you installed it, but the folder where it got installed to is not in the path, so it's not seeing the program. Okay, so just to have a better idea of how your shell works, what you'd want to do is update the path variable. Now, how do you do that is different by operating system. I'm not going to get into that in this video, but just so you know, like that's what you'd want to do. You'd want to update this variable to have the folders where those programs are in. Okay, but just my goal today is just to kind of make you aware of sort of the scope of this tool, so that way you can easier go learn more about it. Okay, so now you know that there's a thing called terminal that can have different programs. One of those programs you should be aware of is Git. Okay, I'm not going to get into Git at all in this video because Git's a very deep topic. I do have videos where I go over Git, so go on YouTube and type in AlexMerced Git, and you will find several videos where I go over in depth about Git. But Git is a very, very important piece of software for tracking the versions of your code. So when you write code, you usually use Git to kind of keep track of your progress. And that way, if you ever need to reset back in time, you can, because Git's keeping track of different versions of your code. Okay? But that's as far as I'll go today. Technically, this is the mechanism that makes versioning work for everything. So if you ever use something like Google Docs, and you can, if you've made some changes and you want to kind of go back to where your document was, let's say a day ago, it's because there's something like Git working under the hood, allowing it to be able to go back in time. Okay, that's essentially what Git does. It's tracking versions of the same thing. There's a lot more to it, but just to give you a high level what Git is doing for you. Okay, so there's a bunch of different programs in terminal. Okay, but we're going to leave it at that. Now, another piece of software you're going to want to get familiar with as a software developer is Visual Studio Code. So again, Visual Studio Code you can download by going to code.visualstudio.com. Okay, and it should automatically detect what your operating system is and give you the installer for the particular operating system you're on, and you're off to the races. Okay, now a cool thing about Visual Studio Code is you can open it up to a specific folder, and a lot of people, I give this advice to them and they don't follow it, and they make life a lot more difficult for themselves. What you always want to do is take whatever you're working on, think of basically all the files for a particular project should belong in one folder. So if you're building a new project, it should go in a different folder, and whatever you're working on, that's the folder that should be open in VS Code, not your top level folder with 50 different folders in it. Okay, if you do that, you're going to make Visual Studio Code a lot slower, because now it's keeping an eye on all those files, which is going to really slow things down because it's tracking a bunch of stuff that you don't need at the time. And two, it's not going to be able to help you as much because you're giving it too big of a context. So whenever you work in VS Code, you should always open a folder, and it should always be a folder specific to the project that you're working on. So right now I have this folder called New Dev. But let's say I was starting a new project. I would click Open Folder. And then let's say I want to create a new folder in here. I call it like Project 1. I'd create a new folder here. And see, now I'm in the Project 1 folder. And again, this will look slightly different depending what operating system you're on. So if you're on Mac, it'll look different. If you're on Windows, this will look different. And then I'm going to open that folder. So I can always tell what folder VS Code is open to by looking right here. So right there is the name of my folder. Okay, wonderful. There's always going to be this welcome tab. You can just close that. Doesn't really do anything. You can close these things. Okay. Now, what's important here is you're going to see these icons here on the side. Okay. The most important ones are going to be these first few. So the first one is like, this is the File Explorer. This shows you what files are in the folder or environment you're currently working in. So I can create files using this command. I can create folders using this. Okay. You can also use the terminal. So the cool thing about opening up terminal in VS Code, so it's the same terminal as you saw a second ago. So I could use a standalone terminal, or VS Code allows you to use a terminal inside of VS Code by clicking here on terminal and clicking new terminal. Now the benefit of this, it's the same terminal. So all the same commands, has access, it's still talking to your computer. It's not like a special VS Code thing. But the benefit of doing it here is to notice that it didn't start in my home folder. It started in the Project 1 folder. It's automatically going to open terminal to the folder that you're working out of, which makes life a lot easier, because then you don't have to navigate there on your own. You don't have to be like CD here, CD there, CD there. You're automatically where you need to be. Okay, so generally, like if I'm working on a project, I'm going to make sure that my VS Code is open to the folder for that project. That way my terminal is automatically open to that project. Cool. Okay. So that's all fun and good. And wonderful. And then I can just do commands in here like anything. So I can make a folder. So I say make dir cheese. Okay, and you see the cheese folder appeared over here. I can make a file, touchbread.js, and see, create a little file. Cool. Okay. So I can do all the stuff that I can do in any shell, I can do from here. Now the thing is that especially if you're on Windows and you downloaded Git Bash, by default, it's going to tell you which terminal you're using here. So right, see, I'm using Bash. Maybe I don't want to use Bash. Maybe I want to use something else. What you can do is you can go to usually around here, you can maybe configure terminal settings. And let's see what app settings does it give me. Okay, terminal. Okay, I mean, I only have Bash. But if you're on Windows or Mac, you might have different terminals. I think on Mac, you might probably have Bash and what's called Zush. Zush ZSH is the default for Mac, but it's the same exact thing as Bash. So you don't really need to care. It's the same thing. If you're on Windows, usually defaults to PowerShell or CMD, which are not like Bash. So if you downloaded Git Bash, which I recommend you do for Windows, then you're going to want to make sure that you change the default emulator to Bash. Okay, so you see it should say Bash here if you have it set to the right one. Or Zush. Zush is fine too. Okay, but if you're on Windows, you don't want the default to PowerShell. You can. You just, anytime if you're watching my videos, you're going to need to translate my commands to whatever the PowerShell ones. You're going to want to learn how you do things in PowerShell and be able to translate them for my videos. Okay, or you can just, everyone uses this Bash and it makes life easier. Okay, but you can do that there. And the cool thing is here, I can take this terminal screen and split it into two terminals like that. So if I click here, see now I have two terminals. There are going to be times where you need multiple terminals open because you're running one program in one terminal and running another program in another terminal. Okay, so I can have them side by side like this, and I can click right over here to close these. So I can just right click here and I can kill the terminal. Or if I want, I can add a whole other one. And instead of them splitting the screen, there's just going to be two separate ones that I can switch between. Okay, so this is really convenient. Okay, it makes it really easy for me to work with terminal with my current project instead of having it in a separate window. But at the end of the day, it's still terminal. It's not like a special version of terminal. It's just terminal opened inside your VS Code environment. Okay, also, and then again, you can open up files in here. So I can click this bread JavaScript file here, and I can type code in here. I'm not going to get into writing JavaScript, HTML, CSS, but this is where you would do that. Okay, and then here you have the ability to work with Git directly from VS Code. Okay, I do have a video on working with Git from VS Code. I do highly recommend still learning how to do it in shell because not everywhere you'll be a developer will you have Visual Studio Code. But the one thing you will have in every developer environment is the terminal. Okay, when you work with a remote web server, you're not going to have a graphical interface. You're not going to have any kind of visual interface to work with. So that's why it's important to learn how to use terminal, how to use the command line, because when you're working with remote web servers at a high level, generally the command line interface is the only interface. Okay, so being able to function comfortably in the terminal is not going to be necessary all the time, but there will be times when it is, and you want to be prepared for those times. So I generally just default to the terminal, so that way no matter what computer I'm on, no matter what environment I'm working out of, I generally have a certain level of comfort, which makes me more productive. There's debugging features here in VS Code. There's certain, you can add extra functionality to VS Code through a thing called extensions. So you can go to the extensions store here, and I can search different extensions. I have a separate video where I go over Visual Studio Code extensions that I think are worth installing. Look up that video, just type in Alex Merced, Visual Studio Code, and you can find those videos. Okay, and yeah, that's pretty much Visual Studio. So Visual Studio Code is where you will write code. Okay, terminal, okay, the shell, whether we're talking about it inside its own window or inside of VS Code, is generally where you're going to run commands. So a lot of times to run your code, you're going to have to do that from shell. So you'll type in node, the JavaScript file, or Python, the Python file. You'll run the code from there. Okay, so it's going to be your main environment for interacting with your code. Okay, you're going to have your browser, because again, mostly what you're writing, or most applications nowadays work in the browser. They're web applications. Okay, so you're going to interact with the browser. And if you go to any website, so let's say I go to, let's say google.com. If I right click on the website, okay, see this little button called inspect here. If I click on that, it's going to open up DevTools. This is another thing you're going to want to get really, really comfortable with. Each of these tabs in Chrome DevTools give you different tools for debugging your code, because one of the most challenging things as a developer is figuring out why your code may not be working the way you think it is. So when it comes to web development, especially on the front end, where you're trying to figure out, hey, why is this visually not looking right? Or why is this functioning not quite right? You're going to have these different tabs that will give you different tools for trying to figure out what's wrong. And learning what each of these tabs do and how to take advantage of them will be key to making yourself more productive, and also making you pull your hair out less. Okay, your debugging tools are going to be your best friend. Okay, another tip when it comes to like seeking out information is using Google. Okay, every developer heavily uses Google. Okay, so I might say, hey, like, how do I parse a string in JavaScript? Okay, now notice my search. I'm not saying how do I do a full thing. Okay, generally if you try to type in asking something, if you try to ask Google, say how do I like build a website, it's probably, or how do I build something that's like several steps, you're not going to find really good answers, because there's so many different ways to do the same thing. What you want to do is generally first kind of think of what your approach to a problem is, okay, and then kind of Google something more specific. So I'm thinking, okay, hey, I have this thing I want to do. One of the steps to what I'm doing is I need to parse a string, meaning I need to chop that string into pieces. Okay. So, and then specifically, I'm operating out of the JavaScript. If I just say how to parse a string, well, it might tell me how to do it in Python. It might tell me how to do it in Java. It might try to tell me how to do it in Ruby. That's not going to be really helpful. So you want to be specific as possible in your search. But again, you don't want to be so specific that you're asking something that no one would have ever asked before. Okay, you develop a feel for this over time. But basically, the idea is you're trying to think, okay, what is a specific thing I'm trying to do? What is the language that I'm trying to do it in? And then you ask the question. Okay, your goal shouldn't be to look for the exact code. Like, your goal isn't to try to find what is the things I need to type. You want to understand what you do maybe want to find a code example, but you want to understand what that code example is doing. Okay, so like here, Stack Overflow is where you're going to find a lot of these answers. So what I do is I'll go through Stack Overflow responses and look for questions that are similar to my question. You're never going to find generally perfect comparisons, like someone who has the exact same problem as you have. But you might be able to find people who have similar problems that you have. And if you can understand what their problem is, it can help you have a deeper understanding. And those learnings can then help you solve your problem. Okay, if you're trying to look for just someone who's going to tell you exactly how to do something, you're going to have a hard time finding an answer. But if you're looking for pieces of knowledge that can help you better understand the problem, so that way you can find the answer for your situation, you're going to find this very helpful. Okay, so I might find so he asked a question and someone provides an answer. So I'm like, oh, this is cool. Okay, that's the thing. But maybe I don't understand this. Okay, I'm like, I'm not quite sure I fully understand this. This is where AI can help you. Okay, so the simplest AI to use would probably be bard.google.com, because it's free. ChatGPT works fine too, but you might need a paid account for that. So if I go to bard.google.com, I could take advantage of it. Now, again, my goal here isn't what maybe I want to do is just I want to try to understand this code better, but just by looking at it, I'm not quite sure I fully understand what's going on here. Okay, so what I can do is I can say, hey, can you explain to me, like I am a child, the following code? Okay, and then basically it'll come back to me with an explanation. Okay, and then I can use that to better understand the code that I'm looking at. Okay, so I'm going to be like, okay, sure, here is a friendly explanation. This line of code creates a variable called coolVar. Now I may be looking at this, okay, like I get that's what it's doing, but how is it doing it? So I might be very confused, like what is this var keyword for? What's that doing? So then I can continue the conversation and say, hey, what is the var keyword doing? And you can use the AI to kind of help learn it more in depth, not by trying to look for the exact answer you need right now, but trying to look for a deeper understanding for what you need to know to get to the answer that you're trying to get at. Okay, and you're going to find this very, very helpful. So it'll provide you better examples, because sometimes it'll provide you a more specific explanation that you're looking for, and better examples to help elucidate what you're trying to figure out at the time. So generally, this is the pattern I'll go through. First, I'm going to use some Googling to kind of figure out sort of what is the general pattern that I'm probably looking for, and then I might use AI to kind of help explore that pattern a little bit more in depth and kind of understand the syntax a little bit better if I don't already understand it. Okay. At the same time, again, you can also go to docs.devnerds.com, and there's several things on JavaScript specifically that'll help you understand the syntax and logic. But again, certain patterns and algorithmic patterns to do specific things, it's probably not going to find a specific definition for that because there's so many infinite possibilities. But using a combination of like Googling to find some examples that might be what you need, and then using AI to help understand those examples better can then help you rearrange those pieces to fit what you're trying to do. Okay, but if you go straight to like asking AI, hey, can you solve this problem for me? One, you're not going to learn, and two, oftentimes that code is not going to work because basically oftentimes you're not providing it enough context, and generally if you don't understand how to code it yourself, you're probably not going to be asking AI the right questions for it to write code that is going to work for you. Oftentimes, if you can get AI to write good code for you, you probably already can write good code. Okay, so in that case, in these early stages, you should be using AI to help understand code you've seen more so for it to write code you haven't seen, because you won't know whether that code is good or not or what it's doing, and you're going to end up getting very confused very quickly. Okay, so yeah, hopefully that's a good rundown of the tools available to you and the things you need to learn. Again, there's a lot more information on all of this here at docs.devnerds.com to help you in that journey. But again, these are the tools, and good luck on your journey. I'll see you all later.